When I moved to North Ogden, I was called to be an explorer leader. There were 10 forts in Weber County, and I thought, well, now I'll be prepared 10 Tuesdays in a row if I take those boys to a separate fort site each week and tell them the story of the fort. And then one of the boys piped up and said, we ought to make a film strip of these forts. And I had heard that Farrell Collette had done a painting of the Goodyear Fort. And so one night we took the boys and the camera out there to take a picture of that fort. Well, as we were photographing this fort, one of the boys said, that wasn't like the fort at all. And he gave a description of his fort. And Farrell Collette didn't come anywhere near doing it. So I went up and met with Farrell and gave him a second chance. Well, as I was describing the forts, in walked Dan Martino, and Dan said, Bill, you ought to submit an application for funding from the Bicentennial Commission. That application was submitted, and with $20,000 from the Bicentennial and Bill Child's $25,000, I commissioned 24 of Utah's finest artists to do 65 historical paintings. Well, they tell a story. They're events that have never been illustrated. The discovery of the Great Salt Lake, or the Fort Buenaventura. I had a list of about 100 subjects. I let the artist pick whichever he wanted to paint. And then I would get them a historical record of some kind, and then they would put together the painting based on that information. And they did remarkably well. I wanted to have a painting done of Ogden High School. So I asked the first art teacher at Ogden High School. There was a PWA project, Public Works Administration under Roosevelt, and he has the PWA truck in front of the building. He pegs the time and the place and does a masterpiece. It was just a lot of fun meeting those artists and then seeing the work come in. Farrell Collette, he was the greatest animal painter in the country. And here's Miles Goodyear leading these horses that he bought in California. It is the longest horse drive in U.S. history. 4,000 miles those horses were driven. I even asked LeConte Stewart, the dean of Utah Artists, to do a painting. It was at the Lake Park Resort on the tip of Syracuse. And I said, well, how much do you want for the painting? And he said, I don't want to be paid. I feel honored that I would be selected to do a painting. There were two artists that were not selected by that committee. One was Lee K. Parkinson, very prominent Utah artist. Lee K. and Farrell Collette were... Well, Farrell Collette came into my office one day with one of his fort paintings, and he came in 10 minutes after Lee Parkinson had left. And Lee had delivered his painting, and it was hanging on my wall. Farrell Collette walked in there and looked at that, and he said, oh, that's a marvelous piece. Who did that? And I tried to keep him, but he walked up there to that and looked at it and leaned back and said, well, I guess he can do some fine things. I've shown those paintings and told the stories of the paintings to over 25,000 people in Weber County and all the elementary schools and out in the community. I would take half a dozen paintings and then tell the stories of the paintings. And it just increased their interest, not only in the painting, but in the history of Ogden. That was my motivation. It's many stories that illustrate historical fact, things that actually happened. It gives an illustrated history of northern Utah like nothing else.